Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fourth webinar in our Economic Mobility Learning Series. We're so glad you're here with us, and we're grateful you're taking the time to pause and learn and reflect with us. We know that time is hugely valuable and precious for all of us, so we do hope you'll really dial in and set aside the multitasking if you can, and come ready with your questions. Before we dive in, I do want to briefly ground us in the Greater Houston Community Foundation, why economic mobility has become central to our work, and how this series fits into something bigger that's building in Houston right now. So, the Community Foundation exists to inspire and create meaningful and positive change with our donors and for our community. We call ourselves Houston's philanthropic partner because that's exactly what we do. We work alongside individuals, families, businesses, advisors, foundations, and nonprofits to direct generosity where it can do the most good. Over the last 30 years, our donors and partners have collectively given more than $3 billion to nonprofit organizations that improve lives and strengthen communities. But our role extends beyond grant making. By leveraging data, trusted relationships with incredible partners, and our ability to convene, we are focused on turning generosity into sustained progress for Houston. I have the privilege of working with a fantastic team and leading the Community Foundation's community impact work comprised of three core initiatives. First, Understanding Houston. Please visit understandinghouston.org. Continuously gets updated. Our regional indicators platform launched in partnership with Rice University's Kinder Institute for Urban Research that really roots us all in credible data and trends about where Houston is thriving and where we're falling short. Second, the Greater Houston Disaster Alliance, where we partner with the United Way of Greater Houston, government leaders, and a trusted network of more than 100 nonprofit partners to improve our region's response to disaster recovery and resilience. And third, most connected with today's program, our high impact grant making initiative, which makes it easier for our donors and partners to invest together in the most promising solutions to Houston's pressing challenges with a focus on economic mobility. Last year, as many of you know, Houston made headlines as the most impoverished major city in the US. In Harris County, nearly 1 in 4 children lives in poverty, and research shows that poverty often persists across generations. 1 in 3 children who grow up in poverty will remain there as adults. And more broadly, as we're looking at the US, only about half of children will go on to earn more than their parents as adults, signaling a decline in intergenerational economic mobility. These realities have implications not only for children and families, but also for Houston, our future workforce, economic competitiveness, and long-term prosperity. The barriers facing low-income families are hugely complex, they're interconnected, and deeply persistent. And meeting this challenge will require a response that is equally ambitious, coordinated, and sustained. And that brings me to why we're all here this morning. Last fall, Houston leaders from across sectors came together for an inaugural Economic Mobility Summit. The energy in that room sparked something. Community partners leaning in together, hearing the same facts and information and research, and really wrestling with one of the most defining challenges of our time. Why is it so hard for so many people in our region to get ahead? And what can we actually do about it? Those conversations led us as co-conveners to explore the potential of establishing a Houston Economic Mobility Coalition, truly a collective effort, a cross-sector effort committed to advancing economic mobility at scale. And we remain on that journey. And as we do that work, we know we can't build in a vacuum. One of the clearest things we heard from summit participants was we want to keep learning. People wanted to know what's working in other cities, what lessons and solutions might we draw on to inform what we build together. And this series is our call to that question, that desire. Through it, we'll hear from leaders in other communities who have built and tested approaches to improving economic mobility at scale, not to copy and paste and not to say everything is working perfectly there, but to help us learn faster and be smarter as Houston writes its own story. So we're so excited to have Amy Ahrens Terpstra here with us today. She's leading very impressive work through the Promise Partnership Utah. Promise Partnership Utah is a collective impact initiative working to ensure every young person in Utah has the opportunity to achieve economic mobility. It is a set of diverse organizations, institutions, and individuals working as one team to improve outcomes for Utah's young people, cradle to career. Amy is the managing director for Promise Partnership Utah. She has 30 years of experience in social impact, participatory research, and results-based accountability. And through her work, she partners with local community, education, and civic leaders to elevate community voices and promote data-driven action to achieve more equitable outcomes. Prior to the Promise Partnership, she's directed the Social Impact Research Center. So I hope Flavio and the Kinder team is on the webinar too. And she did that at the Heartland Alliance in Chicago, leading research focused on poverty alleviation and social justice. So very relevant background to the work that we're doing here. We're excited to hear more about the Promise Partnership Utah model and ask questions. So as you hear what Amy is sharing, please drop your questions using the feature at the bottom, the Q&A feature. It's sometimes hidden under like the more button. So put your questions in there. We will aim to use that through the Q&A and theme as we go to get as many questions answered as possible. And if we have time, we'll do a Menti at the end. So get ready to get your phones out or to interact and kind of reflect with us to capture some key takeaways. So with that, I will turn it over to Amy.
Oh, thank you so much, Diana, for the warm welcome. It's so wonderful to be with you today, folks from the greater Houston area. I spoke with Chelsea a couple of maybe months ago at this point, and was just really impressed by the learning stance that your community has around economic mobility. I'll preface everything I'm going to say in that we are on that learning journey with you in Utah. No one in this country has kind of figured out precisely how to reverse the trends of declining economic mobility that Diana had alluded to. And so we are all taking the best thinking from around the country and really putting it together on behalf of our young people in our communities. So I think my goal today is just to share a little bit about our journey here in Utah with you, and then engage in a conversation with you via the Q&A about what's sparks your curiosity, what's working in your community, all that good stuff. So on the next slide, I'm actually going to start where Diana kind of left off in talking about some of the trends in upward mobility. So I noticed that you all have somebody coming maybe in your next series from Opportunity Insights, and being that your focus is economic mobility, I'm sure you have heard about that research, maybe even dug into that great website. But I really want to root sort of the reason that Promise Partnership Utah exists in the very interesting and kind of troubling trends around economic mobility in this country. So this is a map that shows economic mobility by kind of, maybe it's county, I can't quite remember how it's broken up at the local level when we zoom out this far, but the darker red colors are worse economic mobility or upward mobility, and the blue are better economic mobility outcomes. And when we're talking about economic mobility in this context, what this kind of at its core really means is that a child who is born over the course of their lifetime, by the time they reach their mid-30s, like, are they making more than their parents were earning at that same age? And so what you can see is that in many parts of the country, that is not true. Many folks are making less than their parents made. They are not making out of the quartile, the bottom quartile. And you notice that the state lines here aren't that great, but you know where Texas is, and you know that Utah's sort of northwest. There we go. Yep, somebody's outlining that for us. Utah actually has some of the best upward mobility in the country. But if you go to the next slide, and this again is for the lowest quartile of kids, When you start to zoom in and the map gets more granular and you start looking at neighborhoods, you start looking at census tracts, you see in Utah the same thing you see in any community around the country, which is that bigger trends mask more local trends. So, this is a look at the Salt Lake region, and you can see in our community, our east side has a lot more upward mobility than our downtown core and our west side. And if we kind of did this map and we zoomed in all over the state of Utah, even in our very rural areas, you would see lots of trends like this. You would see some neighborhoods having high degrees of economic mobility and others having a fair amount lower. So if you go to the next slide, um, the reason that this is interesting and that it matters is that the same trend plays out with nearly every measure you look at related to well-being. So this is a look at life expectancy in our state by small areas. The red in this case, the darker colors are better, so higher life expectancy, and the gray areas and the brown areas are lower life expectancy. So in those same west, or I might have said west, I meant east. I do know my directions. East, up in the Salt Lake area, those east areas have higher life expectancy, and west and more rural areas have lower life expectancy. And these are really big differences. Park City, which you might be familiar with, a large ski town here, and life expectancy of 86 years. In South Salt Lake, one of our promised communities, dramatically lower at 74 years of age. And if you go to the next slide, again, another trend, this is educational attainment. You start to see the same areas of the map shaded at about the same color, indicating that opportunity and advantage is really concentrated in particular communities in Utah. The next slide is child poverty. These, again, the red makes you sort of think bad, but red is better here. And so we have lower rates of child poverty in some of our northern communities, and in our rural areas to the east and south, much higher rates of poverty, including a 35% rate of poverty in San Juan County down there in the southeast corner of the state. The next slide. So when you're asking yourself, or when we're asking ourselves the question in Utah, if we want to improve economic mobility, and we know that all those indicators around educational attainment, life expectancy, child poverty, family poverty, they're all related to economic mobility. The research really helps us understand that. The question becomes, how and where do you intervene? And for us, when we were embarking on a journey to decide how we were going to add value in our community, where we really landed was that those childhood years, those from cradle to career, were the highest leverage point for intervention. If you could ensure that children have a cohesive and great experience from the time they're born to the time that they go on to get that first job and get into the workforce, if we as a society and as a community can do that right, then those other indicators are going to improve and economic mobility will improve. And the research backs that up. And so our partnership began by really focusing on these key milestones along the cradle to career continuum. Kindergarten ready. If kids aren't entering kindergarten ready to learn, they are going to have a much more difficult time as they go on through our educational system. They need to be reading by third grade, right? Because third grade is that turning point. You need to be able to read to learn going forward beyond third grade. We need to be proficient in math by the time we're in eighth grade, because that is a predictor of how well we do in high school and college, graduating high school ready, and then getting into the workforce and getting that family earning wage. So that's really how our work has been organized. And we have some key initiatives that I won't go too deep into today that help support those along the way. But on the next slide, I want to dig in on one of those key indicators. So This is a look at third grade reading in our state by a couple of different student categories. And so you can see there at the bottom, about half of students are proficient in reading by the end of third grade in Utah. That's not awesome. In and of itself, we're leaving half of our kids behind, which no one should be proud of. But as you look at the different student groups, and I'm positive you see this same trend play out in your community because it is repeated in community after community. But you see that rates of proficiency are lower for our economically disadvantaged students, for our Hispanic students, for our students with disabilities. We have the lowest rate for our students with limited English proficiency. So when we're thinking about this data, the reality is this is the hard and stark reality, and nobody likes when I say this. But this data is a reflection of our current effort, our collective current effort to improve third grade reading. This data is a reflection of our school system. It is a reflection of our nonprofit communities that are trying, or our nonprofit organizations that are trying to improve reading. It is a reflection of everyone's current effort to improve reading. So then the question really becomes on the next slide is whose responsibility is it to fix this? Right. And I sort of wet the well by indicating that, those data are a reflection of all of our current efforts. And so the question then, or the answer then really is quite obviously, it's likely everyone's responsibility to fix this. We don't believe in our community that improving those metrics along that cradle to career continuum are exclusively the school system's job. We pile everything on our school system in this country and ask it to do so very much. And even though those indicators along the cradle to career continuum are often data that are generated by our school system through testing, et cetera, it's not actually only a reflection of their contribution or their challenge to fix. But what often happens on the next slide when we say who's responsible for fixing this is we all say it's all of our responsibility, but what we're really doing is pointing fingers at each other and saying, yeah, it's kind of all of our responsibility, but really, like Joe here next to me, he needs to do a better job at his thing. If I'm a third grade teacher, well, if those kindergarten teachers just did a better job, the kindergarten teachers are going to be pointing at parents and saying they're not doing what they need to do in those early years. And they're giving me kids who aren't ready to learn, and I have to do so much, and I'm expected to do so much. Our local businesses are just screaming, hey, we just need better educated workers. And this is often the reality, even when we know in our heart of hearts that it is truly everybody's responsibility and we all have a role to play. So on the next slide, at the core of our work at Promise Partnership Utah is this relatively simple idea, but it's so difficult to execute, is that we need to move from a culture of blaming each other and parsing out responsibility in little ways to shared accountability. We need to all hold accountability for the outcome as deeply as our school system does, is our view. On the next slide, because if we don't, and when we don't, this is what we look like, right? So we might all care a lot about third grade reading or kindergarten readiness or high school graduation or, I don't know, whatever your outcome is that you really care about in your community. And there's many of us who care about it. So even if we're sharing accountability for the outcome at the highest possible level, if we are not actually working together, this is what we end up looking like. We're just a bunch of talented, well-meaning people running around, bumping into each other and not executing particularly well on a shared action plan to actually move the needle on the outcome. So my equivalent of this is like, I'm a Chicago Bears fan, unfortunately, mostly for most of my life. And this would be like if the Chicago Bears just like recruited a bunch of super talented football players and put them on the field at Soldier Field and were like, go try to win a game. Right? We would never approach a sports anything. Pick your sport. We would never approach it like that. You need that collection of talented players, but you cannot just put them on the field and ask them to all try to go win the game. What you need is a game plan, right? You need plays. You need a coaching staff. You need a back office who's running the statistics and who's providing the team with data about the challenge of the other team that's coming their way. You need them to understand how well they played in the last game and what the data shows about what worked in that last game and what didn't, right? You need the people who are advertising the team and reaching the fans and getting them to the game. You need this entire ecosystem of people who are actually working together and each have a distinct and clear role to help the team win the Super Bowl. And we don't operate like that when it comes to solving our community's most complex social problems. But if we did, we could look like the next slide, which is what a professional football team looks like when they're executing a play and a series of plays in a game to win the football game and then eventually win the Super Bowl, right? We're organized, we're coordinated, we each have a sense of where we're at on the field. We each know our own stats, we know the team's stats, and we know what we're up against. We have a good sense of it and we have a sense of how to win. And this is really what we're aiming for in Utah. This is how we are trying to organize all of the different folks who care about the same outcomes. We're trying to get as organized as a professional football team. On the next slide, that's essentially what a place-based partnership is. And so the words here, like all of the jargony words, you're probably familiar with them. You've maybe talked about them. You've heard them from other folks who have spoken with you, and you might be leading place-based partnership work yourself. But at the end of the day, a place-based partnership is a locally led, no top-down approaches, cross-sector collaboration that's focused on improving those shared measurable outcomes for children, families, and communities through that aligned action that's represented in that graphic on the previous slide. So the shorthand that we like to use here is on the next slide, which is a place-based partnership is essentially your community's pro team for young people. That's what Promise Partnership Utah is. It's our community coming together. It's our coaches, our football players, our stats folks, like everybody. And in, translating that, it's obviously our nonprofits, our business community, our government agencies. We're all coming together to show up like a professional football team for young people with that much focus, that much discipline to actually reach the goal. And the next slide, how we operationalize that in our state is through 3 layers of work. So we help communities that want to build really awesome community schools. So you might be familiar with the community school model, really wonderful model and strategy that ensures that the school is an incredibly welcoming place, that families are at the table, that barriers to learning are removed. Teachers can just show up to teach, students can just show up to learn in the classroom. We also then, around those community schools, build what we call promise communities. That's our kind of language here locally for what federally you might be familiar with as promise neighborhoods. So there's a whole federal Promise Neighborhoods grant program that was inspired by the Harlem Children's Zone during the Obama administration. We've never received one of those grants, but we've modeled our work here off of that. And what that really means is that the community, both with the schools, but also outside of the schools, is coming together and aligning their work to create a cohesive pipeline of supports for students from cradle to career. And then we have networks. These are our systems-focused networks. So these are groups of people who are coming together and saying, we know we can't program our way out of poverty. We have to fundamentally change the systems, our policies and our practices that kind of undergird lack of opportunity and create more opportunity for families. And so we have a series of networks that are working on a variety of issues to make sure that opportunity is sort of baked into our systems in a way that it's currently not. As a side note, our sister organization, 211, which I believe you all have in your community, is also part of our family of companies here in our organization. And so we are always thinking about how we are aligning and integrating that really awesome resource that is 211 into our place-based partnerships. The next slide. I just wanted to maybe, finish up here before we turn to conversation together with just a couple of slides that give us a sense of sort of how this work is working. And so this is a look at we have 7 promise communities, and 2 of them are what I would consider sort of quite mature, have been at it for a long time, and are doing kind of really advanced work. In those 2 communities, 5 of 8 cradle to career outcomes have improved since we began this work in 2014 together, and 35 of the disparity gaps between student groups are closing. I'm sure you all know and experience this in your community. COVID was a huge disruptor, but even with COVID, we kind of look at a COVID baseline, like, when COVID hit to now, how are things going? And still 5 of 8 outcomes are improving, and even more of our disparity gaps are closing. On the next slide, this is just a look at some of the elementary schools. One of the trends around the country during COVID was that most schools had a very significant drop in elementary reading. And in our 2 promise communities that are strongest, that was not the case. I believe the next slide has a graphic that shows, this is the data is always noisy. It's sort of always moving from year to year, but you see that green trend line shows the overall arc. And you can see that it actually increased quite significantly in the year after COVID. So it's really a testament to the hard work of those educators in those schools, the additional resources that ESSER really provided to schools, and that partnership infrastructure that was so important in the schools to making sure that every kid was accounted for, every kid had what they needed to engage in remote learning, and that every kid had their family's basic needs met if that was getting in the way of their education while they were experiencing the pandemic. Next slide is just breaking out of the student groups. That's always important to disaggregate our data. And you can see again the trend line that all of our student groups have improved in these elementary schools, these really strong community schools in South Salt Lake. The next slide, this is a look at, we have a really high refugee population in the Salt Lake area. And for many years, refugee students, and in many schools, refugee students, we do not do very well by them as a system. And so we had noticed back in 2014-ish that our refugee students at our high school in our 2 flagship promise communities were really struggling. They were consistently not graduating with their peers, and it was very concerning. So we began a very concerted effort to have the community wrap their arms around those students. And now our refugee student rate, graduation rate at that school outpaces non-refugee students, which I think is on the next slide that you can see. The top line is refugee students and the bottom is non-refugee students. And so this is just such a testament to what is possible when a partnership, in this case around this one particular high school, knows its number, knows how many refugee students there are, knows how they're doing, and then targets their efforts and aligns their efforts around that student group. And on the next slide, at this particular high school, refugee rates are higher than, graduation rates are higher than refugee graduation rates in our entire region, and have stayed higher. And then I'll end by talking about a really large policy win that our partnership had a couple of years ago. So Utah is one of those states where kindergarten is not compulsory, and we were mostly only enrolling kids in a half-day program. And this has been a concern for a long time. When you talk to any teacher, time on task matters. The data is really clear on this. And so we, for many years, built a coalition that advocated to pass full-day kindergarten in Utah. And so you can see within 2 years that the just sheer share of kindergartners going to full day versus half day increased dramatically. This was a very funny moment because most of our legislators, the biggest barrier, I think, to getting this legislation passed was legislators saying families don't want full day, families want half day. And the data so clearly bears out that when offered a full day program, the vast majority of families want it and take it. And then on the next slide, because enrollment isn't the ultimate goal, increased reading proficiency is. And so this is a look over time at how much reading proficiency increased during kindergarten from beginning of year to end of year. And you can see it varies by year, but it's anywhere, kind of from 12 to, let's say it's an average of like 15%. In the first year that full day kindergarten was offered, the increase from beginning of end of year for all kids increased to over 20%. And then on the next slide, do I have another slide? Oh, nope, go back, sorry. The slide I didn't put in, but intended to put in, was a look at children who were in full day kindergarten compared to children who were in half day kindergarten and their growth. And that data is even more interesting because the kids who were in full day had a incredibly large gain from beginning of year to end of year compared to kids who were only in the half day program. So we're very proud of this result, and we cannot wait to see how then that stacks up over the years to helping improve that third grade reading measure. And then I'll end by telling you a little bit about where we're going. So again, we have sort of this multi-layered infrastructure of partnerships at the school level, community level, and at a systems level. And right now, our footprint is largely along the Wasatch Front, which is the Salt Lake metropolitan region. And we know that we have large areas of our state. I showed you those maps, especially in rural communities where economic opportunity and upward mobility are simply not within reach of all students and of all families. So we, this past legislative session, backed by years and years of work, passed a piece of legislation called SB 165. And SB 165 created the REACH initiative. So REACH stands for Raising Expectations Through Accountability, Community, and Hope. And we really used the work of the promise communities that we work with and support here in Utah, looked at others nationally, and we designed this initiative to essentially establish Utah's framework for place-based partnership work. And we're really excited that in that framework, that is now the state's framework, it is very clear that partnerships must be cross-sector. They have to have a measurable set of indicators, which are defined in the legislation, that they need to be working on and committed to moving the needle on. It really importantly emphasizes a backbone role. So, in that football analogy, somebody's got to be the coaching staff for the team. It can't just all be the talented players on the field. That's really important, but you need all those other roles that I had mentioned. That's the backbone role in that analogy. And the legislation gets really clear about what that is and why it's important. And then it requires that community partnerships develop an investable economic mobility action plan. And so in order for the community to be funded, they have to have their action plan that lists out all the strategies that they're pursuing to move the needle on the indicators that they've chosen, which of the players, the talented players, are doing what, by when, and how they're going to measure it. And then it has a really strong emphasis on being data-driven and engaging in continuous improvement in the same way that that football team looks at its stats, analyzes it, and has that drive its performance in the next game. So SB 165 both provide sort of structure for communities already doing this work, and eventually will provide funding for those communities already doing this work. But very importantly, it provides an on-ramp for any Utah community that wants to do this work and is willing to do the work in the way that a place-based partnership kind of needs to be done, which we're really excited about. And a lot of our rural communities are really eager to begin doing this work together. Importantly, the legislation requires a technical assistance entity, so a statewide intermediary that's providing sort of support to communities doing this work. And then, so we passed the legislation this past year without the appropriation because it was a tough budget year. So it sets up the structure and the system for the whole thing. And then next session, we'll be going back with that appropriation request and really aim to ensure that there's significant resources to support communities that are building their partnership and doing their planning and putting together that investable economic mobility action plan, and then significant resources for communities that are ready to go, that have that plan and that are kind of have implementation dollars to actually make it happen. So this is the way we're really thinking about meeting our mission, which our mission is really simple, but huge, right? 100% of kids and families thriving. Reach is an expression of sort of how we intend to get there and how we, as a backbone, a statewide intermediary, intend to support local communities to pick this work up and lead it locally in a way that makes good sense for them. So I will stop there and maybe I think invite Diana back into the conversation if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, yeah. Thank you so much. That was really a great, quick. I know there's so much more we could cover, and we have a lot of questions. We welcome folks who are listening to put in questions. We have a couple already, which is great. Um, I'll kick us off just for like orientation. So, how long has the Promise Partnership been around? And based on our previous kind of learning and conversations, you touched on its evolution and how you all started a little
Yeah.
bit with community schools and then added Promise communities and the system level change work. And so just kind of speak a little bit to the journey from beginning to now and how long, it's taken, any key learnings that stand out to kind of build on what you all had started with.
Yeah, the kind of more meaty story is that we were actually born out of our local United Way. And so our United Way in the early 2000s was sort of going through a bit of a like, who are we? What do we do in our community? What's our value proposition here? Kind of going through those things that every organization goes through, um, every number of years where we're really interrogating ourselves and our contribution to our community. And at that point, our board and our partners, our staff, were sort of coming to this realization that every application we as a United Way were getting in for funding said the same thing, basically. It said two things. The one first thing that they said was like, we are awesome. Like our organization is so awesome and you should fund us. We're doing great work. We're getting good outcomes. Look at our data. And then the second thing they said was, but conditions are getting worse in our community, and that's another reason you need to fund us. And we began to think about that as the results paradox. How can it be true that every nonprofit in our community has all this great data about how great their program is, but how can it not be adding up to moving the needle in our community on big issues like poverty, child poverty and the like? And so that set off this huge soul searching journey that eventually led us first to community schools in sort of the mid 2000s, mid aughts to, let's say 2005 to 2010. And that was really great. And we realized like this is a really good model, like a very local, very school-based model that brings in lots of different players. Like it really is a very local expression of good collective impact work when it's done really well.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
what we realized was that was important, but still not sufficient for completely moving the needle on outcomes at a community level or a state level. Kids spend 80% of their childhood hours not in school. And
Right.
so if you're not paying attention to the time outside of the classroom, you're missing a huge opportunity to ensure that children are on that path. So that's when we kind of added in that Promise Communities layer. We had learned about that. We took a visit to the Harlem Children's Zone, became really inspired, layered that into the work. And that was probably about 2011. And then in 2013, 2014, we became exposed to Strive Together. A lot of
Hmm.
you might be familiar with them. And this was really the moment where we said, there's the missing piece to this model. Like we can have great schools and we can have the community show up for schools. We can build strong ecosystems in our community for kids around those schools. But if we're not actually trying to fundamentally reshape our systems, so that schools are better in the first place, so that our communities are safer and have more opportunities, so that there's not barriers for kids, then we're missing that. We're missing something. And so we layered in sort of that systems change piece at that level. And that was about 2014. So I would say our full partnership sort of came together in its current form around 2014. It's a long way to answer your question.
No, that's great. That's really, really helpful. So you all have been at it for some time, for a
Indeed.
couple of decades in different permutations. Um, and it is a journey. We have a related question coming from the audience, which is just how long did it take before you started seeing results? Is if we take the football analogy, like how long did it take to get organized and start seeing sort of measurable results that keep people motivated and kind of understanding that this is worth doing, this is working. Yeah.
It is such a good question. I should be really clear. Like my team we don't do any direct service work. We're not the local backbones in community. We are sort of really that regional or state intermediary that's supporting local communities and doing this work. And one of the things we often talk about as a team and as a partnership is that so much of this work is, to your point, Diana, and to the questioner's point, like really hard to see progress on the daily. Like it really is sort of generational work. And often when you're in it and your head's down and you're working so hard on something that is so difficult, getting people to trust each other and show up together, like it is such hard work. It can be and feel really disheartening when you don't see the big needle move like you want it to and like you're aiming for it to. And so large part of our practice has really been on celebrating the small wins. And this is where like a really good data function can come in,
Mhm.
because we really are celebrating sort of the programmatic wins that each of our partners are contributing. We celebrate the kind of collective wins that aren't the full moving the needle, but they're about partners coming together in a really great way and showing up in a way that they hadn't before. We celebrate sort of those process type wins. And then we do celebrate, obviously the leading indicators and then the ultimate community indicators moving. And in terms of like how long it takes, there's certain things that are a lot easier to move more quickly. So for instance, in South Salt Lake and that Promise community that I've referred to a few times,
Mhm.
what they realized, they really honed in on the fact that juvenile arrests were really
Mhm.
high in the after school hours. So between 3 and 6, lots of kids getting arrested. And the city started the partnership with the city at the helm, began developing out of school programs, after school programs at the different elementary schools and the junior high school, and also community based out of school programs. And so it took them a few years to really get all of those in place. But juvenile arrests in the after school hours over the last 12 years have dropped by 85%. And that was just like, we plodded along for years. Every year we saw the arrests go down, slowly but surely. And now when we take the longer view and we look back at the 12 years, we can see a really dramatic number, which
Mhm.
feels really great to people. And so a lot of it is just about, tracking that stuff over time and having the discipline to collect the data, and put it together and turn it back to the partnership, to really have their own work, remain really visible to them.
Yeah. Um, there's another question that's come through the audience, which is about systems mindset. So you talked about Strive Together and the collective impact kind of cradle to career model a little bit. But you also spoke about like United Way and this incredible rich ecosystem of nonprofit leaders who are just focused on their unit and their kind of programmatic impact. So what was the journey to get folks on board with this, or the light bulb moment, or like if there was anything that sparked this shift in mindset that moved from like, yes, we're all doing great work, but no, actually we need to move collectively as a system. Was it this football analogy that like has really like helped click the community? How did you get people on board?
Well, I would say you have to continually get people and keep them on board. Like there wasn't one moment, right? This has been sort of a daily pursuit
Right.
to remind ourselves, remind every partner in the ecosystem that this is how we need to show up together. And there's a few reasons for that. The first is there are almost no incentives in our communities to work together better.
That's right. We talk about that
In
a lot.
fact,
Actually,
yeah,
we're wrestling with how do we
uh-huh,
create the incentives?
yeah.
Like,
And in fact,
how do
there's
we create
many different
incentives?
sets.
What are the incentives?
Yeah, yeah. Like, there in our community, there's no family foundation that says we're only going to fund third grade reading and we're only going to fund it through partnerships. Like that doesn't exist. And
Yeah,
so, the competition for funding, just the way we're all socialized and hold a notion of accountability and responsibility,
right,
we're like partnerships are working against all of those things. And
right.
so at the end of the day, this is about mindset change. It's about narrative shift. It's about hearts and minds. And that is not a thing that you just convince yourself of or people of once. It's an ongoing effort. And people turn over, right? Like people leave their roles, superintendents leave. So you can do great work to work with a local superintendent and they can be the most partnership oriented
Right.
person. But I don't know about in your community, but in ours, our superintendents change every couple of years. And so the work is sort of constant. One of the things that we have found to be, well, there's two things I would point to. Um, One is that you have to, and I've learned this the hard way, you have to align in any given partner organization the mindset and the attitude and the willingness to participate in the partnership from the very top leader to the people on the
That's right.
ground. And if
Yep.
you only have one of those or both, and you
Mm,
need the middle folks too, because the middle folks are where things can either get accelerated or slow dramatically down. And
right.
so you need to like vertically align in any given partner organization the hearts and minds to want to think outside of their own four walls. And then the second is something that we haven't done very well, to be totally honest with you, but we're embarking on now, which is really good narrative communications and strategic communications work about the partnership. I think for a long time we thought like our audience for communications are like decision makers and donors, and we're
Mhm.
completely flipping that script. We're saying that
Mm,
our primary audience is the partners themselves, and they're also the primary contributors to the story. And so by
mm,
inviting them in to tell their story, it's a way to engage and help increase ownership in the partnership, as
right.
well as hold them up and shine a spotlight on them in their collective work.
Got it. That's really helpful. That's a great learning. There are lots of questions now, so I think we're going to skip the Menti. I'm going to make that call. We're going to take questions to the very end because they're coming in, which is fantastic. So, one of the first ones we received was really about just honing in and maybe using the refugee student population intervention to go a layer deep, more deeper, which is what exactly sort of happened? What was the intervention? Who were the partners? Just if you could kind of go into more detail there to give sort of one example of this kind of approach in practice.
Yep. So once we sort of recognize that there was a really significant challenge with the refugee students from this one particular community going to this particular high school, a couple of things happened. So the first was we brought partners together who we thought could have a role in improving that situation, including parents. And we looked at the data together. And what we realized was sometimes it feels so overwhelming when you look at a graduation rate and you're like, oh my gosh, it's only 68%, like, or only 68% of our refugee students are graduating or whatever it was. That feels so overwhelming. How do you get from 68 to 100%? But when you look at the numbers, often the change can feel more manageable. So when we got down to the numbers that sit below that 68%, it was only like 200 and something students. Suddenly, that feels a lot more manageable. Like we can do something about
Right.
200, students. We can
Yeah,
wrap our arms around that
exactly.
number of students. And so that fundamentally changed the conversation. And we just began this really multi-pronged approach. It was like, we got to do the root cause analysis here. Why are students not graduating? Okay, well, one of the key things that came up was that transportation was a huge barrier. The high school that these students are going to is like 8 miles outside of where they live. It's 8 miles
Mm,
away. And so they were really having a difficult time getting to school. Okay, let's talk to parents about what would help solve that problem. We just needed to put some buses in place. We were able to raise some money and immediately begin, putting students on buses, not just to get to school and home from school, but to stay after school and get academic support and to be involved in extracurricular activities. Because another one of the whys was students didn't feel welcome at that school. They didn't feel like they were part of that school community because if they did make the bus, they had to leave right when the bell rang and they couldn't stick around and engage in all the activities that we know make high school feel like a welcoming and belonging place. So we just chipped away, like, what's the why? What's going on here? And then designed interventions that really weren't that complicated, to be honest with you, to make sure that kids could feel like they were part of that school community, had a sense of belonging, could actually be there, and then had some targeted academic intervention for a smaller group of that 200 and something students.
mhm. As I've learned about the Promise Partnership, Utah model and just heard you, it resonates a lot because based on all the learning I've had, it's like, there's the system level work, and often that's like macro level work, and it's scale and it's policy and it's big. But I guess what I've observed and seen is at the end of the day, like the work actually needs to be super micro too. Like it needs to be both and just that example of like it has to be really micro too.
Yeah.
It has to be place based and like people centered. And while we can do collective work at the top, like we actually have to be really in communities and see that same
Yeah.
team of
It,
maybe different sectors, perspectives, but the, and different people, but like the same team and structures kind of coming together to collectively solve the whatever issue is at the root of what's happening. So it's really exciting to see how you all have pulled this together over, 20 or 15-year process and time frame, but just really excited about that. One of the questions talks about like, okay, talk about the cost. Like, what was the kind of money to like support the infrastructure of all of the work that has been happening and how you all think about it. Do you have a sense of that, or do you have a sense of it over phases of the work?
yeah, it's a good question, and my answer is probably going to feel a little unsatisfactory. But at the end of the day, we think about this as sort of having a set of, in a partnership, in a collective impact partnership, you have a set of like fixed costs and a large set of variable costs. The fixed costs we think of more as those backbone costs, and those actually aren't that big, right? Like you need a human who wakes up every day, or a couple humans in any given community who wake up every day thinking about the caretaking of the partnership, thinking about the data, bringing people together, kind of holding the container for the work. And that cost isn't, again, it's not huge. And then you have the more variable costs.
Ballpark, Amy. Just like,
I mean, well, just think about what a staff person costs you, right? Like in
okay.
any of your organizations. And then, there's different functions that a backbone plays. So it depends on sort of, let's just say it's $100,000 per person when have their salary and their some benefits in there. And so in any local community, if you're just starting out and you just need that backbone person, sometimes it's not even a full-time person. You just need somebody to begin to tend to the partnership.
Yeah.
Often there's contributions that folks can make to the partnership and to the backbone role without any additional money. So there might be an organization in your community that's like particularly good with data. They already have a lot of the data that you need at the outset, and they're willing to kind of contribute that as part of their general work for the community. So a lot of it is about there's already a lot of money that is spent in certain ways out there for certain things. And this is an alignment game. It's saying, hey,
Mhm.
can you just the thing you do really broadly in this area, could you like kind of focus it right here? And people kind of hate that. To be honest with you, they have this like visceral reaction. Like if we focus here, we're doing nothing over here, and that feels bad to them. But the pitch is like this spreading the peanut butter thin approach
Right.
doesn't is it working? I guess is the reflective question. Like, how well is it actually working? Like, is it a
Right.
worthwhile experiment to concentrate our existing resources and contributions in a place and see if that can add up to more than the sum of its parts? And if that's true, and if we can create that proof point, then we have a model for going to lots of other additional communities. The services piece is the biggest variable, right? Variable cost. And so when we think about a community school, we often say that, in our model, about, let's say $500 to $600,000 per community school if you have a full-time coordinator and you're aligning some services there. A promised community is so highly dependent. I've seen some models that have kind of estimated between like 2,500 or 30 or 5,500 per young person in the community per year. But there's some cost models out there and some good thinking that you can look into. But I would just offer that, if you have large service gaps, yeah, you're going to have to move to fill them, and that costs a lot more money. But in an urban community, especially, I hold the perspective that there's a lot of resources being spent in a lot of different places already, and it's really about focusing and aligning them.
Great. Um, this is something that I think we have experienced as a tension in terms of rooting what we're building in community voices, not just lived experience and perspective, but also decision making. How have you all thought about more community voice being kind of central and centered in the work, but also potentially in decision making?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, the work is very nested. And so at the community school level, that's sort of baked into the community schools model, this family engagement piece. And so a really good community school is
Mm.
actually structured in such a way, or it moves to structure itself in such a way that parents and caregivers are at the table. And in the older grades, youth are at the table having a say in how their school is run. And so we work with schools to facilitate that. In our promise communities, and then at our systems level, we approach that in a variety of different ways. We have a lot of youth councils that bring youth together to help inform and make decisions about the work. In our, we have a leadership table, the Promise Partnership Council. We have a youth council as part of that, and they actually hold a lot of decision-making authority around what the partnership at that systems level works on. So we have a whole process that we bring through, and they're kind of a key decision point that takes a list of prioritized indicators and potential work, and they're the ones who say, this is what our community needs, this is what our young
That's
people need,
awesome.
and they
Yeah,
pass that on to the other groups of mostly adults to work on. And the way we've also structured that council is to make sure that every community in the partnership has has 8 seats at the table. One of those seats is for a youth, one of those seats is for a parent, one is for an educator, so on and so forth. So we found some structural ways just to make sure it's kind of baked in to our process, and then at the community level, that's sort of really rooted in sort of how the communities want that to happen, or how the parents
great.
there want that to happen.
Pretty sure we're gonna follow up and ask you for the structure.
Yeah.
We're gonna follow up. I'm just like saying that out loud. Um, well, we have a few questions. We're not going to get to all of them, but you touched on a couple here. Um, I, I guess if you needed to kind of delve more deeply into the beginning, like how did you align on shared metrics across cross-sector stakeholders? Is there anything you would have measured differently from the beginning?
Oh, um, we settled on the measures. We went through kind of a whole, like back in those early 2000s, like I was mentioning, we kind of went through a whole community input process. Um, but community input matters a lot, but so does the research and what we know. And so we went through this process to really marry like what our community, cared about, the gaps it saw, and who was leading stuff, who wasn't. And we kind of married that with the research. And that's how we came up with those cradle to career indicators. They're very research backed, and they show that like you need to, have the first one in place to really help meet the second one, and so on and so forth. Um, we haven't changed the milestones over the years really that much at all. We have given ourselves a lot of permission to change how we measure them. So measurement is always a little bit of a unsatisfactory and exercise. And so, like for instance, post-secondary readiness measured by the ACT, it's just not the most satisfying. But like we know that it's fraught with
Right.
lots of things. So we're always kind of shifting how we measure things and that's part of our continuous improvement mindset. Is you know like our milestones are set, but how we measure them, we can always improve on. Is our sort of
Mhm.
our approach.
Okay. Last question. What gives you the most hope right now about the work you're doing?
I firmly believe that this work is the medicine, if you will, for the kind of fraying of our social fabric that I think we all sort of feel, especially at the national level. The distrust of each other, the kind of entrenched camps. I think place-based work really focused on our kids is the medicine for that. And so that's what gives me hope is people coming together, really dedicated to organizing themselves as that one team. Like, is there anything better than that? Is that any more the definition of like what more could be the definition of community? And so that's really what gives me hope is just I really think that this is what is going to solve our community's deepest social problems and help us be better humans together in the process.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Amy, for your time and your thoughtfulness and just Really admire the work that you all have built over many, many years and appreciate everything you've shared. We'll be in touch.
Would
So
love that.
thank you. As we close, just a quick reminder that we have these webinars monthly. And if you haven't already signed up to join us for the next session, it's super exciting. We are bringing in Opportunity Insights, and we've hosted them in the past. Dr. Raj Chetty joined us at the first Economic Mobility Summit, so we're huge fans of their work, but they have some new research and evaluation of the Hope 6 program that is really examining the life trajectories of children who grew up in communities where housing kind of redevelopment was a central intervention, and the policy implications of their findings and the connection to social capital of what they found. And so it's really exciting work and research that's come out, and we hope that you can join us to learn more about it at our next session on August 7th. So, hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone. Have a great Friday.